Hi, this is International Master David Pruess for Chess.com, and today we're going to be looking at the interaction between strategy and tactics, specifically a tactic that comes out of strategy, so a tactic that's set up and follows logically from a strategy. Now, not all tactics are like this. There are also tactics which seem to come out of the blue, and various other origins for tactics, but we're going to talk about one of the more logical and understandable of origins, which is a strategic setup. Now, I'm going to show complete games in this series, but there are certain moves or certain points, which is what I'm interested in teaching you, and that means that some moves I'm going to skip over quickly, and they're just there to allow you to have the full game for completeness sake if you want to. If you want to study the moves that I don't talk about, you can, but it's not necessarily important to do so. So here we go. We get the Benko Gambit, and there are two main points to this pawn sacrifice by black. One is to undermine white's strong pawn here in the center on d5, and the other is to open files on the queen side. And you open files by losing pawns or trading pawns. In this case, black's going to trade 2 pawns for 1, so he's going to lose 1 pawn. So he's going to open files on the queen side to get counterplay, and he's also going to try and weaken this pawn here on d5 by undermining it. Now, white accepts the pawn sacrifice. White can also not accept the pawn sacrifice, but still black will then try and exchange this pawn on c4 to still weaken the d5 pawn. So anyway, white takes. Alright, and black develops this bishop here to its most logical post because he already has a pawn on this diagonal here. Right, so instead he brings it to g7, long diagonal, where it will eye the b2 pawn. And the b2 pawn also happens to be on the b file. And that means that black's actually going to have a couple pieces that cooperate with each other, which is typically a good thing. So I'll just go forward another move to clear those arrows. But if your strategy includes having your pieces sort of work together towards the same goal, that's often a good sign for your strategy. Okay, so now white's preparing e4 with his knight. Even though black has undermined this pawn by trading off one of its supporters, it's still a pretty strong pawn, far advanced in the center of the board. So it's a significant source of white's play in this game, is the strong pawn on d5. Black takes on a6, so that when white plays e4, taking more space in the center, black is able to slow down white's development with this bishop trade, because now white's king is going to have to castle by hand. So this is going to cost white between 1 and 3 tempi, depending on how things get played and how you count it. So now black stops white from pushing e5 that would have kicked his knight out of the center of the board. And this kind of pawn placement 2 steps away from a knight is often how you assure yourself of having a square for your knight. You cover the square on which another pawn would come to attack your knight, and that is that's the role of this pawn on d6, and it's the role of how people often place their pawns in chess games. If you look at master games, it's very typical that they'll be placing their pawns like that on purpose to establish squares for their pieces even before the piece gets there. So, for example, if black's knight were on g8 in the previous position here, then before playing knight to f6, you would actually play d6 first. If your knight were on g8 right now, you wouldn't want to play knight f6 and get attacked by e5, so you would play d6, establishing the square, then you would play knight f6. Alright, so they're completing development. Now there are 2 ways for white to fix their king. One is to play g3 and king g2, and the other is to play h3 and bring the king all the way to h2. And the reason to play g3 is that it castles 1 move faster. The reason to play h3 is that it stops black from playing knight g4. and it also coordinates better with having a bishop on f4, right? To have your pawns on the king side on light squares. So there are positional advantages to h3, but g3 is one move faster. Alright, so black's going to develop, and what they want to do as soon as possible is put their queen and rook on one of these two files, right? Which is where they're going to be able to try and establish pressure against white's queen side. And that is really the number one theme of this gambit opening for black, is to be able to establish pressure on those files. But even if we weren't talking about the Benko gambit in particular, it could be natural to use open files that you have to put pressure on your opponent's pawns, right? So even if it weren't this exact opening, let's go ahead 2 moves and see where black places his pieces. First the queen on a5, and then the rook on b8. So if these pawns here were really far advanced up the board, then placing your pieces opposite them would not be so effective, because the pawns would actually be strong. If you imagine, like, this pawn over here on a5 as a passed pawn, and this pawn over here on b5 as a passed pawn, those pawns would be strong, and the pieces, like, firing against them would be sort of just like trying to hold them back and wouldn't have a lot of scope. But here you see how many squares your rook attacks, right? It's controlling 6 squares. Whereas if this pawn were on b5, your rook would be attacking 3 squares, half as much, right? So if your opponent's pawns are pretty far backwards, and you have open files, it's very natural to place your pieces opposite them, putting pressure on them. So it's a very natural strategic plan for black. White defends the d2 pawn with their queen and completes development pretty much because the rook can come out next. Now, knight a6 to c7. What is the point of this move? Well, the main point of this move is to bring the knight to b5. For example, if rook d1, knight b5, after these knights trade, black's pressure against these 2 pawns has intensified. Now, if you can't see why, we can back up a couple moves and see if you can see it. In this position here, the pawn on a2 is well defended by the knight. That means no matter how many times you attack it with rooks and queens, you can't take it. At the same time, the potential of your bishop to attack the pawn on b2 is blocked by both knights. So black would love to be able to trade off or move those 2 knights so that his bishop can be revealed. So in the variation I just gave, you see black takes a knight that was blocking his own file on a6, right? And now he trades that knight, and he trades white's knight, and now these pawns are under greater fire. Okay, and black's threatening to play queen takes b2, or to play knight takes e4, because he also got rid of the knight that was defending that pawn. So black has really good pressure here. So knight a6 to c7, and the main strategic plan is to play knight to b5. But black also has a threat, which is the typical tactical threat of the entire Benko gambit, I would say. And this is a threat which is born of the particular shape of the pieces in this opening. So let me highlight the pieces that are usually involved in this tactic. The pawn on e4 being the least important of them, of course, but basically the rook on b8 is attacking b2. The bishop on g7 is also attacking b2. Now often in the Benko there are various pieces in the way, right? So here you've got the 2 knights blocking it, but you still have that relation, right, of the rook and the bishop targeting the same point. And white often has a few pieces lined up on this diagonal that black's bishop is on, so those pieces are going to be vulnerable to tactics. And I'm going to clear all those arrows again for a moment. And so the thing that you want to see is that black arranges their pieces in a certain way. There are certain logical tactics that are associated with it. And if you exert this kind of pressure on your opponent with the placement of your pieces, you can expect that there are certain tactics that you'll see again and again